Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event on guaranteed income policies. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. We are going to give folks a couple of minutes to filter into the room, and we will be starting in just a minute.
Hello?
Congressman Khanna, is that you?
Yeah, it says I can't start the video though.
Yep, I am fixing that for you right now. You should be able to join. And we are live. We're just waiting for participants to filter in, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody again for joining us for this really important conversation. I am Catherine Bracy, founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are an organization based in the Bay Area that is mobilizing tech workers on issues that we think will make a 21st century economy work for everybody. So we do three things on that agenda. We educate tech workers about the issues we're working on. We run advocacy campaigns to advance policy that we think will make a growing tech economy create more opportunity for more people. And we connect tech workers to their neighbors so they are better integrated into the civic fabric of the places where they live. We focus on two issues, housing and workforce and labor. I should say some of the issues that we work on, workforce and labor, are more safety net issues, and that's why this conversation about guaranteed income policies is really important for the work that we're doing. I want to introduce our panelists very quickly. We have Natalie Foster from the Economic Security Project. We have Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley in the US Congress, and we have Mayor Michael Tubbs from the city of Stockton, California. We're going to talk much more with them in a minute. Before I kick it over to Natalie to just give us a framing for guaranteed income and sort of the history and context for this broad set of policies, I want to acknowledge that we're having this conversation during a really tough time for our country. And I'm in downtown Oakland. I'm feeling the tension around us every day this week and beyond. And I think it's really important for us to note that, we considered whether we should postpone this conversation, whether now was really the right time to talk about it. But we ultimately decided that it's important for us, if we care about issues like police violence and police brutality, that we address the larger racial structural inequity in our society. And that really is, in the economic systems that uphold our police state. So we thought it was even more urgent to be having conversations about the solutions to our structural inequity, and decided to go forward. But I want to acknowledge that that is really hanging over this entire conversation and colors everything we're going to talk about today. And I really encourage all of you, I assume this is heavy on all of your hearts right now. If you're thinking about ways that you can be part of the solution, that you think not just about supporting police and criminal justice reform, but you also look at the organizations you can support that are trying to create equity across the economy. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie, who's going to kick us off with a little bit of context setting. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you so much for your leadership. Your voice and Tech Equity's voice has made a big difference in California and Bay Area politics in just the short while you've been around, so keep it up. It's needed now more than ever. And it's so nice to see you, Mayor Tubbs and Congressman Khanna. I really look forward to hearing from you. Here is the truth. Long before the COVID crisis was a human-made crisis of an economy that meant that most American families were unable to pull together $400 in an emergency if needed. It was a brittle economy. It was a precarious economy. And now we have 40 million unemployed on top of that. And we're in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, right? More than 100,000 people have died, millions more have been infected, and testing is nowhere near where it needs to be to safely reopen the country. So even when workplaces can rehire people, places where you actually have to physically go into work, unlike much of tech, which I know who we're talking to today, those places are likely risky workplaces. And in the meantime, Congress has generally failed to provide enough paycheck protection, has left tens of millions of families with unemployment issues, facing problems paying for food, gas, water, bills, rent. And we know that the first round of payments weren't enough, that the $1,200 stimulus check that families got went straight to debt and to paying bills and to paying for food, not to anything that sort of would stimulate the economy. And so we also know that it's hitting communities of color the hardest. The National Women's Law Center pointed out that in April, Black and Latinx women suffered the largest job losses in the country. Now, pre-COVID, these were women making just cents on the dollar compared to their white male counterparts. Now, this is an issue well known to Aisha Nyandaro, who runs the Magnolia Mothers Trust out of Jackson, Mississippi. That is a program that gives $1,000 a month to single Black mothers in Jackson. And she knows that the participants' ability to earn an income is hampered by this racism and sexism. So the idea of a guaranteed income is that it provides a floor through which no one would fall. And that floor would ensure resiliency. It would create resiliency that would ensure our communities can handle a public health crisis like the one we're in today, that mothers can put food on the table so their children can eat, and it would challenge the very notion of deservedness. And that is a challenge I hear echoing in the streets every night for the past several nights. Who deserves a safe community? Who deserves a system that works? Who deserves an income floor? And a guaranteed income is really, simply put, it's sort of the two words, right? Let's examine a guarantee. A guarantee would say that no matter what happens, you deserve this, that your inherent dignity as a human being says you deserve this, regardless of what you're able to make in the labor market, regardless of what value the labor market puts on your work. And that challenges modern capitalism, right? Modern capitalism is built around this idea that you work for what you get and that's it. And that you pull yourself up by the bootstraps and that everybody has to figure this out on their own. And a guarantee would say, actually, what do we owe one another as a society? And how do we ensure that in the richest nation on earth, there's a floor through which no one can fall? And the second part is income, right? So the idea is that this is alongside your wages. So alongside what you do for work, you would have this income floor that you can count on no matter what happens in the labor market. And I think that that's particularly important as we're in this pandemic, right? As we're dealing with 40 million people who filed for unemployment insurance. But that will be important in pandemics to come. As I heard Mayor Tubbs talk about yesterday, whether it be climate change induced or whether it be technological change on the workforce, that creating an income floor creates resiliency for people to weather what happens easier than they would without it. So within the big idea, there are actually lots of policy choices. Who gets it? Who gets the checks? Are they universal? Are they sent to people who need them? How do you define need? How is it paid for? Who actually sends the checks? So there's lots of debate, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the congressman who's thought a lot about that and answered and put forward a few answers federally. But those are the choices you can make, within the big idea. And the truth is, it's an old idea. It has dates back to the beginning of the United States. There were Thomas Paine and others were talking about a guaranteed income. But I would argue today's conversation has its roots in the modern civil rights era. And in fact, Black women in the late 60s really pushed Dr. King hard to examine this idea of a guaranteed minimum income as part of the National Welfare Rights Organization. And he did. He took it up in his last book, Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. And the current moment, I think, is really expressing itself in the laboratories of democracy in our cities and our states. So pre-COVID, I would argue that's what's moved a guaranteed income into the mainstream. Our leaders like Mayor Michael Tubbs, who we'll hear from in a minute, leading the first modern demonstration of this idea in Stockton, where 125 families are receiving $500 a month to create an income floor. Where you have the cities of Chicago and Newark, who led the first task forces, pulling together all of civil society unions, NGOs, faith leaders to examine what a guaranteed income would mean in those cities, and have called for pilots in their own cities. And what's interesting over the past 10 weeks is that this crisis has forced more political space at the federal level for big ideas like a guaranteed income. And we've seen strong leadership from the Democratic Party. There have been several bills introduced to create an income floor until the economic crisis is over. Congressman Ro Khanna, who we'll hear from shortly, had the first bill introduced along with Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio. And that would provide monthly checks until the economic crisis is over. There are several in the Senate, one led by Senator Harris here from the great state of California, as well as Senator Sanders and Markey, that again provides monthly checks until the crisis is over. So there's a lot of leadership and they're popular. A recent poll showed that 88% of people want regular and recurring checks. And that's true in swing states, and it's true across the aisle. So despite the leadership and the popularity, the idea of monthly checks, which in policy terms, to get nerdy just for a second, is called automatic stabilizers. So instead of just a one-time $1,200 check, you would put in a stabilizer that says, until we reach a certain criteria in the economy, people will receive these checks. That's what we would argue is desperately needed to pull us out of the crisis and was needed before the crisis. But so despite the popularity, they're still not in the bill that just passed the House. And we really hope Speaker Pelosi and other top Democratic leaders will embrace the power of regular cash payments and put automatic stabilizers in to any final legislation. So with that, I'll just say that, across the country, we are seeing the pain of communities that have been attacked, marginalized, and left out. And we are seeing the desperation of people who deserve a system that works for them, that values Black lives and everyone's labor. And we have so much reckoning to do as a nation. That's been clear, and it's abundantly clear now. So let's provide an income to stabilize every American family and get to the hard work of healing the nation.
Thanks, Natalie. You mentioned Congressman Khanna's proposal, which he is working hard on getting into the next stimulus package. Congressman Khanna, can you talk first just about why you think guaranteed income policies are good policy? And then talk a little bit more specifically about the proposal you've put forward and what its status is, what we need to do to help get it into reality. You're on mute.
Catherine, thank you for your leadership and all that you do for equity and tech in the Bay Area. And Natalie, thank you for your incredible work and help to the Congress in thinking this through. And Mayor Tubbs, good to be with you again. And thank you for being such a pioneer on economic policy. I do want to start just by acknowledging what's happening in our country. I think it would be odd not to say something about that. I mean, last night, when the President of the United States basically directed the military against peaceful protesters and law enforcement against peaceful protesters, it violated the very essence of American democracy. And I'm on the Armed Services Committee. We're working right now to try to put a bill together, an amendment that would block any funding going to the military to be used in a way against our own citizens. That is not the purpose of the American military. And if we want, I mean, I know when Natalie invoked Dr. King, I mean, Dr. King was very clear that he was opposed to riots and he was opposed to looting, but he then goes on to say that if you want to solve the issue of rioting in this country, the only way you do that is by addressing the underlying injustices, the underlying grievances, that's how you tackle these issues. And it's clear that we need police violence reform. So I appreciate your letting me say that. I just thought given the moment, it would be odd not to address that. In terms of Natalie's point, the reality is in this case, a minimum payment is so obvious. I mean, the government has told people you can't work. Now, I think that was correct that the government has said that because we didn't want millions of people possibly dying and we wanted to restrict the disease. But if the government is going to tell businesses you can't work, you can't employ people, and it's going to tell workers you can't work, then the government has an obligation of providing that income. And so having a monthly check, $2,000 is what Tim Ryan and I proposed. There are multiple different proposals, but having some monthly check is absolutely essential to give people the money to make rent, to give people the money to have enough to put food on the table, to deal with this national crisis. The other thing I think it's important to realize with the supplemental incomes is it's rarely the case that this is somehow making someone dependent on income for life. What these are about is giving people the resources that those of us who are more fortunate have. I mean, I was born to a middle-class family and had immigrant parents, but I got to go to a good public school, and my parents had enough money that they could put me in a little league baseball league and pay for my uniform, and I could go on field trips, and I could have books, and I could have clothes, and I got to do internships when I was in college. So the point is, how do we make sure that people have those opportunities, particularly in a knowledge economy, when you're asking people to get new skills, new training? I mean, do you think someone with young kids can give up their job to go take online evening classes if they're not getting some compensation? So these are the critical reasons why we need to support people's incomes so that they can succeed in the 21st century economy. I've yet to meet anyone. I mean, the Republicans keep talking about these mythical people who are getting unemployment checks and not wanting to go to work. I don't know if anyone on the panel has met someone like that. I've yet to meet someone like that. Everyone I meet is desperate to get a job. And even if we have income support, people will still be desperate to get a job. This is not an anti-work policy. This is a policy that enables people to develop their capabilities, to develop their talent, to be meaningful participants. And most of us who have succeeded, if we reflect on our lives, we'll realize that there were a lot of people making those investments in us. And we're just saying everyone should have those investments.
So can you say a little bit about is it really just as simple as everybody gets $2,000 a month? Is it time limited? Are there, do you have to show that you've lost income? How is this particular policy working?
So ours is everyone gets $2,000 a month under 260,000. So if you're a household under 260,000, and it would go on every 6 months, it gets renewed, but it would go on until we had unemployment back to where it was pre-COVID. So it would say response to this crisis. There are now a number of bills, all good bills. And what I've said to the speaker, what Tim Ryan has said to the speaker is, if it's $1,500, if it's $2,400, if the income cutoff is different, we're willing to compromise. We don't think we've got the silver bullet, but it's got to be more than one check once or one check twice, and excluding young people, excluding people who are mixed in terms of documentation. I mean, one thing we ought to make very clear on this call is 50% of the people who are picking our food or doing the farm work are undocumented. Are we not supposed to provide them with support when they've dedicated their entire lives to putting food on the table for us? So there are certain basic things that we shouldn't compromise. But in terms of the details of how long it goes and what the income cutoffs are and what the amount is, all of that we're open to a discussion to see what would get the maximum support.
And what is the status of the proposal right now? Natalie mentioned that it's not in the bill that just passed the House, but we know this is a long and messy process. Where are the opportunities for us politically to exert our influence? I assume the Republicans are not extremely supportive, but some might be surprised to hear that Nancy Pelosi isn't fully on board. How do we start to help influence folks like that?
Well, I think we need to push for the House to take up a bill that provides monthly payments to individuals during the COVID crisis. And we were very hopeful that would make it into the HEROES Act. It didn't. What ended up in was one more stimulus payment. But that doesn't help people as they're planning their lives, as they're planning whether they get to keep their house, whether they get to keep their apartment. They can't rely on a broken political process every now and then to give them $1,200. They need to know that for a certain amount of time, a few months, they're going to get a reliable check that they can use to pay the rent, to make sure their kids get some education, to make sure that they have food on the table. I have heard, obviously being in public service, as I'm sure Mayor Tubbs has, you just hear so many stories of devastation. I mean, people losing their business they've spent 20 years building. People desperate to having to ration their food for their kids and not having more than one meal a day themselves because they want to make sure their kids are eating. These are the stories you're hearing in Silicon Valley. I can't even imagine what it's like in other parts of the country. So this is a time people are desperate for help.
So now we're going to move to you, Mayor Tubbs. We are looking, there is now a renewed interest on this issue, or a bigger spotlight on this as a potential policy solution given the economic crisis we're in. But you were really a pioneer to implement this policy in Stockton and have been running a demonstration project for, is it over a year now? Yeah, so you have both done the work and can say with real hard data how this impacts both individual people's lives who live in Stockton, but also how it changes the city. So I'm hoping you can speak to just why you wanted to be out front on this issue, and then tell us a little bit more about how the Stockton demonstration project is working and what you have found, what you've learned from running it. Oh, also wait, before you start, I'm so sorry. I forgot to say at the outset, we do have a Q&A function. So we're gonna be taking questions at the end for about 15 minutes. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to drop your question in. And we'll be pulling questions out of there at the end. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No problem. Thank you, Natalie and Congressman, for your leadership, advocacy, and voice in this time and all times. And again, I mean, we'd be remiss to have this conversation and not contextualize it in the midst of a national conversation that has been 400 years in the making about whether sort of these inalienable rights, human rights are really granted towards all people in this country, including Black people. And if not, what are we prepared to do about it? And I think to the question I just saw come up on the chat, the idea is that the propose or purport that a basic income or a guaranteed income is a panacea for all ills, that in addition to health care and good schools and affordable housing, folks should have a guaranteed income. And I think in this moment, we have to stretch our imaginations and not play every policy as a zero-sum game, that we deserve all these things as human beings and as a country with the resources to do it. So in terms of your question, Catherine, why did we decide to do a basic income? I think a lot of it just stems from personal experience. As the congressman mentioned, a lot of the tropes I hear about people who are struggling financially just didn't feel real to me because of how I grew up. I grew up in poverty. My mom was a single mother. My mom worked incredibly hard. My mom never took a vacation. My mom never took a self-care day. I never saw my mom go and get her nails done. And she was always working and always working and always working. And no matter how hard she worked, work didn't pay. And for between childcare and having 2 kids and rent and mortgage, it was very, very, very expensive. And I realized that not just in Stockton, but throughout this country, we have people who are literally working themselves to death, that people are working more now than ever before, at least pre-COVID. With very little to show for it in terms of savings, with, as Natalie mentioned, went into Americans not having enough for one emergency, and in terms of assets, particularly communities of color. So as I became mayor of Stockton, I realized that poverty, kind of working poor, economic insecurity was really the crux of all the issues we were having as a city, in my opinion. And I told my team to research some of the most radical policy interventions around getting rid of poverty in a city. Like, how would a city get rid of poverty was the problem. And I told them to not come back with a program, I want a policy. I know about programs, I know about service, I know about cradle-to-career pipeline and linkages, but I want a policy. What can I do from the government seat? And then they came back with this notion of a basic income, citing mostly things abroad, things that Give Directly was doing, et cetera, a couple TED Talks, and we're like, well, this might be it, Mayor. And at that time, it was my first year as mayor. I did not want it to be my last year as mayor, so I said, you know what, I think that we're gonna put this on the back burner, because I'm not sure I would even pay to even test this idea. Serendipitously, a week later, I met Natalie Foster, or re-met Natalie Foster at a conference organized by Tech for America. And she mentioned that the Economic Security Project was looking for a city with which to try basic income with. And then I said, oh, for sure. We have a task force set up in Stockton. We're locked, ready, loaded, and ready to go. And we spent the year co-creating with the community what the pilot would look like, and have been doing disbursements since February 2019. But we announced in October 2017. And for more, I know there's a lot of tech nerds and very smart people on the call. So for more granular kind of data, you can go to stocktondemonstration.org. And I say that because I think people think they want to hear the data, but that's not what folks want to hear. Like, we know people spend money how you spent money this past month, because people are people. And they probably spend money better than you because they have more like pressing needs. So more of their money probably went to food because they don't make $200,000, $300,000 a year. But I think what is important is sort of some of the tropes or ideas we have about economic insecurity. And I think that's been some of our greatest contributions in this space. Number one, understanding and disputing this perception that people are poor or people are struggling because they don't work, or because they're lazy, or because they don't have skills, or because they don't provide value. And when we've seen that all the jobs deemed essential, most of those were jobs that don't pay that well. And those are the jobs we say, you know what, in the midst of the global health pandemic, we have to make sure that these folks are still able to work. And I think just the stories from folks in our pilot, folks like Tomas, who took the $500 to take time off work so he was able to interview for another job that had better wages and benefits. Or folks like Laura, who took the $500 and was able to pay for rent increases that she didn't anticipate coming. And countless other stories like that. We see that people are smart, and that the issue with people not having money isn't that they don't know how to manage money, is that they don't have money to manage. And then lastly, I think this pilot has been helpful, particularly in this moment, to really challenge notions of who deserves what. And who do we trust to give money to? Because again, and the congressman knows this well. In 2017, there wasn't much debate on the majority side, at the majority of the time side, as to whether rich people, notably rich white dudes, people with $2 trillion in tax cuts, whether they would know how to spend that money, whether they would know how to make good decisions. It was just ubiquitous almost and accepted that of course they know how to spend money. And there's been no audits for how that money was spent. I guarantee more of that money was spent on frivolous things and luxurious things and drugs and alcohol than has been spent with the little $1 million that we gave to folks in the city of Stockton. I think we've been really forced to the question about who do we trust with money, who do we trust with resources, and lastly, and probably most importantly, like what is human dignity attached to what we produce, or is it attached to our humanity? Because I get very sick of this argument about work, dignity being attached to work, because we allow people to work in this country in types of undignified conditions with like no healthcare protection, not able to take time off, no parental leave, no family leave. There's no inherent dignity in working 16 hours, sleeping in your car to drive Uber and deliver food for people. Like the person is dignified, but I would argue that work that produces stress and anxiety and inability to persist in a pandemic like this is inherently undignified. So lastly, just to encapsulate everything I said, I think what's most important about the guaranteed income is, as Natalie said, and we've been saying in Stockton, that it allows us to build resilience because we live in a time of pandemics. I think it's dangerous. I mean, COVID-19 is an extreme example, but next year there'll be some sort of climate disruption. This year is supposed to be the worst hurricane season. In California, we have all types of fires, and folks, there's going to be all types of economic disruptions. And the guaranteed income allows people to build a foundation in the floor, and it has to be regular so that folks are able to build the resilience to persist during these times. And then last but not least, that we have to have a conversation about universal human dignity and what dignity do we afford to each other that isn't charity, but is really rooted in notions of justice and kind of the society and country we want to be and we have a chance to be.
Yeah, and just, to your point, I think even for people who kind of, I think, wrongly see this as sort of an alternative to work, I mean, I believe that there's dignity and value in work and being productive, but, what we've seen over the last 30 years is, capital returns have not gone to labor, right? And so people are working harder and creating more wealth for other people, and that's not coming back to them to sort of actually correctly value the work that they're putting in. So, for the people who think, well, we can't just like pay people for not doing anything, we are currently undervaluing work in all kinds of ways. And this feels to me like a way to correct that inequity in how productive time and work, who the value for that actually goes to. So, sorry.
And Catherine, just really quickly on that note, and I'll promise you I'll be quiet after this, but
no,
I think also it's also been very enlightening in that particularly women in our society do all type of work that isn't compensated. When you think of like domestic work, child rearing, et cetera, that's work. That's being home with my 7-month-old. That is hard work. And I think we should be paid for doing that important societal function. And I think it's interesting that if we do it outside the house for somebody else, it's a job. But when we do it for our kids, it's not. So I think to your point about dignity being attached to work, that I think people want to feel purposeful and people want to contribute. And I think if we broaden our definition of work, we can encapsulate sort of all types of disabled people and other people who are contributing in ways that may not fit current notions of work or what work is.
Yeah. So don't mute yourself yet, because I have a follow-up question for you, which is what's next for the demonstration project?
Yeah, we're super excited. Thanks to a generous donation from philanthropist Carol Tolman, we'll be extending the pilot for 6 more months with the aim of giving congressmen and others sort of the ammo, the data, the stories, the antidote, the pictures, the test case they need to make the case that this is not going to be harmful, but actually be a net gain. And then we'll also be launching a Mayors for Basic Income Network sometime before the end of the month to really get other mayors and other elected officials on the ground involved in saying, hey, we want to test this idea, we want to pilot this idea, and we want to see action on this idea. Because again, we know that COVID-19 prevents a window of time, but if we don't get it right now, I fear for what happens when, not if, but when the next pandemic occurs, if we haven't figured out how to shore up the fundamentals during this one.
And I mean, I just applaud you for taking this on and doing it when before anyone really was doing it. And it's great that philanthropists are supporting it. What would you need to make this just the regular norm for residents of Stockton, money-wise, policy-wise, political will-wise?
Yeah, I think a great start would be, thank you for bringing that up, Congressman, ensuring that at least to start with during this COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's Senator Harris's bill or the Congressman's bill, that we have reoccurring monthly payments during this time. And I say that because once you give people something, it's very difficult to take it back without some political backlash. And I think once we see how it's helpful, how it doesn't destroy the economy, how it actually boosts productivity and boosts health outcomes and makes us a greater nation, I think that will solve the issue for not just people in Stockton, but people throughout this country. So I think the immediate first step is making sure that as we do CARES Act, because we're spending like trillions and trillions of dollars. So let's just make sure some of those trillions go to people like us.
Well, I'm now moving back to the slides show. Before we get into the Q&A, I just want to call out some of the ways that people can actually help right now. Natalie, I'm going to allow you to kind of walk through what folks can do. And then I want to point out that we are going to be emailing more details about all of this stuff to everybody who's registered for the event. And then Herman from the Tech Equity team should be in the chat right now. He is going to be dropping in some links to some of the things that Natalie is mentioning. So, but don't feel overwhelmed. We're going to give you a lot of information about what you can do, and then we're going to send you the tools so you have them in your inbox to take action on them when we're done with the webinar. So Natalie, do you want to talk through what folks can do to make a difference here?
Yeah, so, I think this issue is very much at a tipping point. I mean, you have leadership like Congressman Khanna, leadership like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who has a bill that would also create $2,000 a month. I mean, there are a number of bills in the House and Senate. That's a great place to be in. That means, there's a real policy discussion happening on how to do it, not if to do it. But leadership isn't quite there. So if you live in San Francisco in particular, call Nancy Pelosi and say, you want to see monthly checks. That's a very important part of the recovery. And if you're a political donor, you should note that. If you live in San Francisco, you should note that. So call leadership. Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, give them a call and say, you want to see this. And then 2 would be to donate. So I know folks are doing that, but I would recommend donating to groups that are doing direct cash giving. So that's the 3 that I recommend. There are many. Happy to follow up with more if you want more. But the first is the National Domestic Workers Alliance, has a coronavirus fund that goes directly to domestic workers. And as someone pointed out earlier, I think the congressman, the undocumented are what have fallen through the policy cracks, and that hopefully could be rectified. The recent House bill that was passed does extend the supports to the undocumented, to I-10 holders, but the first bill unfortunately didn't. And so that's why I think the National Domestic Workers Alliance fund is particularly important, because so much of their community is undocumented and they're able to get money directly there. And then 2 is give directly. Also looking for, they're targeting communities on food stamps and able to move the money through debit card right away. And then I would also recommend what Stockton is doing. The mayor has set up a COVID response fund in Stockton as well. And I can guarantee your dollar goes far there. And then, but relatedly, philanthropy can't solve this problem. It has to be government. And so fund advocacy. Income Movement is a great organization that came out of Andrew Yang's presidential run. A lot of the leaders from there launched Income Movement, and they're working to move this idea through politics. And there's a number of other groups on the advocacy front as well. And then the mayor, do you want to take the last one, which is the mayor's basic income network?
It's still very nascent, but for the end of the year, for the end of the month, excuse me, there'll be a website and everything. But if you live in a city and you have a mayor, tell them to email me at mayor@stocktonca.gov to be one of the early adopters or early folks as part of the Mayors for Basic Income Network, which would be, again, a network of mayors that will work to amplify the importance and the deservingness of our constituents to receive kind of regular, reoccurring kind of cash payments as part of our 21st century social safety net.
Yeah, and I just want to add, Natalie didn't toot her own horn, but the Economic Security Project has been working on this issue for well before Andrew Yang had even heard of it. So, you know, he obviously did great work to bring this idea into the mainstream, but there are organizations like Economic Security Project that have been doing the work for a long time and really doing great advocacy work. So that's another organization you can support if advocacy is what you want to be supporting with your dollars. Okay, so with that, we're going to move to the Q&A, and I'm going to invite Marion Wellington back to the conversation. Marion is Tech Equity's communications manager, and she has been in the chat and the Q&A, and they have been in the chat and the Q&A, and we'll be surfacing questions from participants to throw to the panelists. So Marion, over to you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So we have a lot of questions in the chat. Thank you all for participating so actively. And thank you to all of our panelists for an amazing conversation. The first question that we have is, oh, Natalie, do you mind? I think there's a little echo. Great, thank you. Okay, so the first one is about a lot of the nitty gritty of basic income. Folks are asking, how does it work out long term? Would cost of living rise accordingly? Specifically for Congressman Khanna, how do we pay for UBI? And then also how is it distributed across the country based on cost of living?
Well, right now, we are in a very low inflation environment with very low interest rates. And the Fed chair has said that the biggest thing Congress can do is get money out to people so they can spend it so that we can get people back to work. I mean, if consumer confidence increases, that's how we increase employment. And I believe getting money into the pockets of people right now will prevent greater unemployment and greater deficits. So first of all, we could repeal Trump's extraordinary tax cuts to the very wealthy, cut some of our budgets of foreign wars. But more importantly, we need to understand that this money getting to people in a time of economic crisis is actually going to save us from even bigger deficits.
Yeah, I think there's a question around the short term, which, I mean, your policy is specifically targeting until the unemployment rate is back to where it was. But if we're thinking about how this becomes not just a disaster response policy, but a long-term economic resiliency policy, you know, what do you think about, you know, Liz Warren's proposal, for example, her wealth tax, or other ways in which we could rebalance that dynamic that I talked about, where all the value and wealth that's been created over the last half century has really flowed to the top and not gone to workers?
Well, I support the wealth tax, and I think that that's important. I mean, it's important to see how much we would raise from the wealth tax and what we could use to support it. Of course, there are a lot of different goals. I mean, I think we need to have Medicare for all. I think we need to have free public college. I think we need to have support for early childhood education and childcare. So we have to just look at how much revenue we would get out of a wealth tax, and then see where we can have some kind of supplemental support for families that need it. I mean, the EITC is another way to get at this, which does that for a lot of people, but then you would need to complement it for those who are out of work.
Natalie, I know you've been working on other kinds of forms of direct cash support policies, including expanding the EITC. Can you just explain what that is, the earned income tax credit, and how policies like that would work or play into this whole conversation about direct cash support?
Yeah, and I would also just say we're in an unprecedented moment. So we don't know what the long term will look like. And I think what we do know is moments of crisis are when America historically has pushed through big shifts, big changes. And I think we're at that moment. And so part of what I believe is that it's a lot harder to take something away from people than it is to give them something, unfortunately. I mean, that's actually borne out by behavioral economics. And so once people understand that a monthly check could be part of America's social contract, that we're rebuilding, and that people could have an income floor in addition to whatever they choose to do for work, that would become something very hard to take away. That's what we saw with Social Security, many of other programs in our country from the New Deal era too. So that's where I think that these two connect up. But that said, the earned income tax credit is part of the tax code that historically for the last 40 years has been the way that the government transfers money to people who need it the most. And it's very successful. It's bipartisan. And it is just way too small. The people who receive it, it helps, but it needs to just be much larger. And so, again, Congressman has been a leader in thinking about how you'd modernize and expand the tax code to meet the way people work today and to meet people's economic vulnerability, prior to COVID. So you could just make it much more generous. You could make it more people receive it. Expand, the eligibility, and make it monthly, make it automatic. Right? There's no reason actually that you should have to go to H&R Block and file taxes and have a huge cut take out of them when the government knows exactly how much you made. If you don't file any fancy deductions, the government knows exactly how much you made. And we could simply send you an email that says, do you still live here? This is how much you made, right? Click here if you want to pay your taxes. And that would increase the number of people who receive these important tax credits dramatically.
Great, Marian, back to you.
Great. So we had a couple questions about how our economic crisis longstanding relates to the racial injustices that are happening across the country. So Suganthi asks, in the name of racial justice, don't you think we should change the language so we're not calling it a crisis since the pandemic, when communities of color have been in crisis for decades under the current economic structure? How can we change the language to highlight how long this has been a problematic system?
Yeah, Mayor Tubbs, I think that's a good question for you because you were such an early mover on this, and the way that you shaped the Stockton demonstration project was really based on that argument. And it was well before COVID was even a thing. So I'm wondering if you can speak to, it's not just about obviously the moment we're living in now gives us this opportunity, but this was a crisis before. And all the stuff we're seeing explode now is really a reflection of just the cracks that already existed in our economy. So how do you think about that? How we talk about this from a racial equity perspective and from a entrenched historical racial equity perspective, and not just an opportunity to meet the moment?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think to your point, Catherine, we launched a pilot because we viewed poverty as a crisis, as a pandemic, and one that folks were in way before COVID-19. If anything, COVID-19 has just preyed on the fact that we were already in an existing pandemic. You look at the disproportionate way that people of color, poor people without access to healthcare, people with high rates of comorbidities, et cetera, are impacted by said virus. But that virus just preys on existing pandemics and existing social inequities. And really highlights the areas of our social contract and our social structure that we have to change. So I 100% agree. And absolutely, I think even the conversation we're having about labor and value and dignity, a lot of it's probably rooted in kind of plantation capital, when your value as a Black person at the time was based on how big you are and how much you could produce, how much cotton could you make, how many kids could you give, and that's how you were deemed valuable, and that's what the price that was paid for your humanity and your labor, right? So I do think part of the conversation about basic income is really, again, sort of a conversation about just some of the rotting issues at the kind of root level of our country. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic, while horrific in impact, gives us the opportunity to step back like a doctor would and to give the grim diagnosis as to what's really ailing this country, and also the difficult sort of treatments and the chemotherapy we'll have to go through as a nation to get to emerge healthier and really kill the insidious cells of white supremacy and racism and patriarchy that have been rotting our country at the core. So long answer to say I 100% agree. And we have to talk about COVID-19 as a crisis that preys on existing crises.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just add, I think that if there's a silver lining to this moment, it is that, you know, you can't really, good people can't ignore the clear evidence in front of us that, you know, racial inequity makes the country weaker, and it makes the economy less resilient. And if we are not addressing those issues as part of this larger conversation, we're not gonna solve our problems, our economic problems, but we're also going to be much less resilient when the next thing happens. It's not just, resiliency isn't just about, you know, is FEMA well funded? Resiliency is really about, can our communities, you know, react and absorb these kinds of events in a way that they can bounce back from it. And what we have seen is that we clearly aren't able to do that in the way that other developed countries are able to. And if we don't solve the racial inequity issues, we won't, we're all at risk. We're all at risk. Marian?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that actually leads me to my next question, which is a lot of people and grassroots organizations and individuals have been raising money for mutual aid funds as kind of a band-aid during the crisis. So I forget who asked, but do these funds help support policy initiatives to formalize UBI, and how can we connect these type of like reactive and dynamic mutual aid funds to build a broader coalition to support UBI and other forms?
What's your take on mutual aid as a form of direct cash support? How does that fit into this whole conversation? Sorry, I was asking you, Natalie, but happy to have anybody.
Yeah, Natalie, great.
I think direct cash aid is really important and deeply insufficient. So we need to do it. And if you have money, you should be giving it right now. The funds we're recommending are generally funds that also are building power for working people. So like the National Domestic Workers Alliance is also the association of domestic workers who have very little political power, but that has to shift. The One Fair Wage campaign, which came out of the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which supports tipped wage earners in restaurants, has a fund, and also, you know, builds support for that part of the workforce as well. So I think those are great places to put your mutual aid dollars, but it has to be a policy response for it to be meaningful in people's lives. I mean, you know, even the dollars given away in this moment dwarf what Congress has passed, right? You know, a $3 trillion HEROES Act being the most recent one. That is where the resources are, and that's, you know, how we have to ultimately do this.
Yeah, Congressman Connor, were you going to weigh in there as well?
No, I have nothing to add to that. Let me just say, because I've got to jump on what they call the conference call for the House. I really appreciate Economic Project and Natalie's work on this, and really appreciate Catherine, everything you've been doing, and Mayor Tubbs. And I'm confident that there's so much momentum for this idea. I mean, it's no longer just a fringe idea as it was a couple of years ago. People see it polls very well. It's common sense. And I think if we mobilize, we can make a big difference and get this implemented.
Well, thank you for joining us. We know you have to
Thank you.
The hard work of actually getting the money for this. So we're, you know that we're behind you, and Godspeed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, if for those who are interested in mutual aid and this really tough sort of dual, you know, I'm not sure how to feel about it, because, you know, they shouldn't have to exist. We should have enough resiliency in our communities that people don't need to self-organize to raise money to support their neighbors. But on the other hand, it is a really powerful sign of what we can do together. And if you're interested in reading more about that, Gia Tolentino had an essay in the New Yorker from last month I forget which issue, but it's really goes into that dynamic, and also talks a lot about how mutual aid is a really good tool to reinforce organizing strategies, to Natalie's point. Marianne, I think we have time for one more question.
More question? Sounds good. All right. We have actually a question from someone who grew up in Stockton. Her name is Kat, or their name, excuse me. And Kat says that they're very proud to see the city thriving under your leadership, Mayor Tubbs. And Kat asks, what has been your biggest surprise or takeaway from the seed thus far?
Well, first, you're always welcome to come back, Kat. But we have a long way to go get to thriving, but we are working incredibly hard, and I appreciate the kind words. I think two things are probably the most surprising. Number one, how a lot of these ideas that were so deeply ingrained, once interrogated or pushed on, I was like, oh, there's really nothing really underpinning this idea. It was just an idea that we all widely held. Like when we start pushing back about sort of dignity being attached to personhood before it's attached to work, and maybe instead of dignity of work, we're talking about the purpose that comes from work or from contributing, and how that seems to make sense to a lot of people in a way when that first episode, like, you can't do this pilot because what about this? But once we pushed on the idea, it's like, oh, wait. And other idea, or the notion that people are poor because they make poor choices. And then we like pushed on that a little bit and said like, oh, wow, actually people are making incredibly complex and difficult choices with very limited resources. And these choices in the context of the environment they live in and the resources they have actually make hella sense. And then they're like, oh my God, this is brilliant decision making. So those, and then I think, and then the last thing is, and for me it was very humbling, in that, because when we started, I was more interested in testing the idea rather than being an evangelist for an idea. Meaning that I was just interested, like I want to know what works. I know poverty doesn't work and lack doesn't work. So I was interested in testing everything that could work as long as it did no harm. But I didn't come in and say like, this is going to be amazing. I'm just going to spend the next 4 years talking about. And then in talking with people, I found that I had a lot of biases in that there was no way I was smart enough to know how all 300,000 people in my city would spend their money. So at first I was like, well, if the housing is the issue, let's just give everyone a $500 housing voucher. But then what I found in talking to people is that folks' incomes are so volatile and everyone's circumstances are unique. And you have to give people the agency to make the best decisions, because for some people in this month, the most important thing is paying off a credit card or paying off student debt or dealing with rising utility costs because the kids are home now because they're sheltering in place at home, or buying more food. And some months it may be an emergency that happens with the car, and some months it may be rent. But for everyone I talked to, there was a different and very contextualized individual response to how they would spend $500 in that moment. And that made me take a step back and say, well, wow, first of all, I'm not that smart to think for 320,000 people, but even if I was, I don't want to use brain space thinking about how 320,000 people could spend their money when no harm would be done if I allow 320,000 people to spend money how they deem best, and understanding that the vast majority of people make rational decisions, and those who don't are people. And I mean, that's a status quo situation, that there's no intervention, there's no policy, there's no anything that people do where we get 100% on. So that's not, it's at the worst, it'll be in line with the existing programs and existing decisions that people make.
Well, that's great. And we're so excited that you are continuing the project, and we're looking forward to being able to stand alongside you and evangelize from what you're learning and help the policy spread. So thank you for joining us. It's 1 o'clock. I just want to let everybody know we will be sending you a follow-up email so you'll have the resources that you need to take action. If you work in tech, really encourage you to join Tech Equity as a member. We are your voice advocating for just economic policies in California. And as I said at the top, if you're really feeling this week in a heavy way, understand that it's more than just criminal justice reform you need to be using your voice for. It is these broader economic policies as well. And that is what we're doing at Tech Equity every day. And we really would encourage you to support the work that we're doing. So we'll see you on email. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mayor Tubbs. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Marianne, for throwing us some great questions. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Bye, y'all.